Hey everybody. So today I want to go through the third and final part of my Greek philosophy section, and this will be covering Chrysippus the logician. And so this is, just to give you some context, this is my thesis. We're going through God and modality, an excursus on the ontological proof. So let's jump right in and let's look at what Chrysippus has to say and see if we can gain some insight here. So, Chrysippus, the section on Chrysippus is going to start on page 24. Alrighty, so let's jump right into it. Alright, so Chrysippus is from little c dot 280 to little c dot 207 BCE. Okay, perhaps the strongest pillar in the Parthenon of Greek modality is the contribution from the Stoics on claims that are elliptically dogmatized. Beginning with Zeno of Citium, the founder of Stoicism, and I said Zeno of Citium, the founder of Stoicism in the Hellenistic period, members of this school scavenged through the texts of their ancestors to construct the most accurate accounts of modality possible. Without question, the most interesting Stoic to philosophize on modality was Chrysisppus of Soli, worshipped as the second greatest logician of all time, and endearingly noted by Carneades as the pinnacle of his existence. And then I do footnote 34, and I say the quote from Carneades. It says, "If Chrysippus had not existed, neither would I." And then I cite that, and I put the Cambridge Companion to the Stoics, and that was done in 2003. Okay. So, worshipped as the second greatest logician of all time, and endearingly noted by Carneades as the pinnacle of his existence, Chrysippus stood to challenge the modal fortitude of both Philo and Diodorus. Not, however, was he so rash to reject both systems completely. Instead, compliments and criticisms were awarded to both lines of thought. Lastly, Chrysippus was the master of Diogenes of Babylon, a man whom some have attributed the first inklings of an ontological argument. And then I put footnote 35, see Michael Papazian, The Ontological Argument of Diogenes, and this would be an article in 2007, and also an article or a thesis done at Fort Bend Christian. Another on the ontological argument was Trevor Jamieson's thesis, and it was Great God in Boots, Malcolm's Argument is Valid, and that was done in 2013. So, let's keep going. Alright, while other Stoic academics centered in on the nature of conditionals and the freedom of the will, Chrysippus also made substantive contributions to the nature of modal logic. Interestingly enough, Chrysippus posed no objections to the formal writings of Aristotle or Diodorus, but he took more concern with the metaphysical implications of their school's doctrines. At a basic level, he conceded the four modal categories of necessity, possibility, impossibility, and non-necessity. In terms of definition, however, he pursued what appears to be a combination of Philolaean and Diodorian insights. First, it's important to note that Chrysippus did not see the modals as operators like the Peripatetics and Megarians did, but as values of an assertable. An assertable, or sayable in this case, is the Stoic equivalent of a proposition, and will henceforth be synonymous with the term. The modal values that Chrysippus assigned to assertables went as follows. A proposition is possible, which admits of being true, there being no external factor to prevent its being true. Necessary is that which, being true, does not admit of being false, or if it does so admit, is prevented from being false by external factors. And then footnote 36 is the Cambridge Hellenistic Philosophy, page 527. So the definitions put forth by Chrysippus suggest, in the spirit of Philo, that the internal consistency of a proposition decides whether it admits of being true. That said, Chrysippus deeply disagreed with following this conclusion to its logical consequence. If internal consistency is all that's important, then wood is capable of burning even when submerged in water, because it has the internal consistency to catch on fire. Clearly, this conclusion is not viable. In response, Chrysisppus distinguished between two types of modal notions: species possibility and actual possibility. In species possibility, some predicate P is possibly applicable to an individual of a natural kind K, just in case K's can, other things being equal, be P's. And let me just read that one more time. So in species possibility, some predicate P is possibly applicable to an individual of a natural kind K, just in case K's can, other things being equal, be P's. And that's the same source from Cambridge Hellenistic Philosophy. All right. In other words, wood can always burn theoretically, or K can always be P theoretically. However, in actual possibility, there are some circumstances that can obtain, such that the internal consistency of an object is not always actualized. Nowadays, this distinction is considered obvious and goes without saying, but in the time of Philo, this news was held as groundbreaking. Next, Chrysisppus turned his attention toward the temporal method of modality posed by Aristotle and developed further by Diodorus Cronus. The main problem that Chrysisppus posed for the temporal method was that of possible non-actual objects. This objection plays upon the above objection raised by Proust, insofar as it states that simply because an object does not obtain, does not ensure it is not possible. For example, philosophizing cats never have or will obtain, but that does not mean that their nature is internally inconsistent. It means the evolutionary history of felines is such that language and connection of higher order thoughts did not come to bear in what we would call common house cats. Therefore, nothing suggests that this state of affairs is impossible. To be clear, the difference between the attack of Chrysisppus and the attack of Proust is that Proust focuses more on relevance and Chrysisppus focuses more on instantiation. For Proust, talking about whether an object obtains is not relevant to modal discourse because it states nothing about the possibility of that object. For Chrysisppus, however, human free choices can affect the instantiation of otherwise possible states of affairs. The example he gives is, quote, "If I had the opportunity to smash the jewel, that helps ground the inference that nothing but my own character is responsible for my not doing so." And then footnote 39, I say A.A. Long and probably D.N. Sedley, the Hellenistic philosophers, translations of the principal sources with philosophical commentary, and that was 1987. So, by shifting the responsibility to, quote, "my own character," possibility is no longer grounded in the actuality of an object in time, but the actuality of my actions in time. Thus, if I had acted differently, different possible circumstances could obtain. Of course, as soon as freedom of the will is brought into the equation, Chrysisppus necessarily allows for the law of future excluded middle on contingent propositions to refortify his causal determinism. Finally, to finish defending his case of modality, Chrysisppus was plagued with the burden of overturning the master argument because its implications went in direct violation of his form of modality. The master argument was first brought into the Stoic school by Zeno of Sidon, who studied under Diodorus Cronus. When Zeno first introduced the argument, one of his students, Cleanthes, immediately began work on objections. Cleanthes observed that the argument's application of propositions into the formula was valid, and thus he would have to object to one of the first two premises. Cleanthes therefore railed against the first premise, which stated that every past true proposition is necessary. As it turns out, there is more than one way of interpreting premise 1 of the master argument. The first method is posed by Prior and implies that Diodorus was trying to transfer necessity from the past to the future. If this is the case, Cleanthes' objection would be to, quote, "the transfer of necessity from past to future." In that case, he will have argued, as Occam later did, that only statements which are genuinely about the past and not past tense statements in general are necessary. And then footnote 40, I say Richard Gaskin, the Sea Battle and the Master Argument, Aristotle and Diodorus Cronus, on the metaphysics of the future. The second interpretation is that Diodorus truly meant to say that the necessity of the past was fixed. Because Cleanthes was a classic causal determinist, it is very possible he could have rejected the fixity of the past to court. In this manner, quote, he may have thought that no distinction can be made between future and past in the point of openness or fixity. For if strict causal determinism obtains, the past is as dependent on the future as vice versa. And then footnote 41 is just ibid. Either way, Cleanthes passed on the idea of rejection of the master argument in favor of Stoic causal determinism to his student Chrysippus. Chrysippus, however, was attracted to the notion of the fixity of the past. Nevertheless, he was still invested in what he saw as the truth of determinism. As a result, he rejected premise 2 of the argument, which stated that the impossible does not follow from the possible. The best example that Chrysisppus gives of this principle found to hold true is in his attack of a modal axiom similar to which one might start out with in the system K of modal logic. And then footnote 42, I say, for support of this modal axiom, see Alexander, and then I give the source. For attack of this modal axiom, and then I give a different source for that. So the axiom is as follows, and I'm going to write the formalism on the board so that we can see it. All right. So, the axiom is as follows, and I just wrote it on the board. So, Chrysisppus felt that there was a valid counterexample in which the antecedent was possible and the consequent was impossible. Take the following axiom as Chrysisppus supposed. Take the following axiom as Chrysisppus' supposed counterexample. A2. If Dion is dead, this man is dead. In this scenario, the referent, this man, points back to Dion. Since there is nothing impossible about the death of human men, the antecedent, if Dion is dead, holds possible. The second half of the conditional, however, proves contradictory in the mind of Chrysisppus because, quote, it is false while Dion is alive, and after his death the statement that this man is dead is destroyed, and so has no truth value at all. And then 43, I quote Gaskin in the Sea Battle. In the philosophy of language, there are broadly speaking two types of context. Oblique context allow for the substitution of co-referring designators, while opaque contexts prohibit the substitution of co-referring designators. For example, an oblique context might contain debating academics using the name Aristotle and the philosopher interchangeably, while an opaque context might contain a civilian in Gotham using the names Batman and Bruce Wayne. In the former circumstance, the academics know the reference of both names are identical, but in the latter, such identity is concealed. The point for the argument is that Chrysisppus needs to argue for an opaque context, but as Gaskin points out, Chrysisppus evidently does not think that, quote, Dion loses its sense after Dion's death. And then 44 is just ibid. But what then are we to make about the argument above? Gaskin muses, quote, perhaps he was a descriptivist about proper names, and that's the same source for footnote 45. On a more somber note, that would make sense of some of the similarities between the logical systems of Chrysisppus and Gottlob Frege. Okay, overall, the documentation on Chrysisppus' objection is less than pleasing for a more than speculative result. But with the evidence that is given, it is clear that Chrysisppus helped in the legacy of the master argument to ensure the success of his own modal systems. In sum, Chrysisppus was a well put together and highly admired Stoic philosopher, and he stands alone as one of the greatest logicians of all time. Though a majority of his work is not extant today, a great deal has been elucidated on the modal systems he employed and the conditional positions he held on the freedom of the will. relating to the development of modal definitions, there are hardly any to compare in the whole of Greek philosophy. Moreover, the influence he spread not only on Eleatic logic, but logic in general, was used by his successors such as Antipater of Tarsus and Diogenes of Babylon to further Stoic popularity. In fact, Diogenes of Babylon is perhaps responsible for using some of this reasoning to start arguing in a fashion suitable to an Anselmian format. The takeaway from this encounter is that the framework of matured Greek modality culminated and was strengthened in the work of Chrysisppus. Thus, the gift of the Greeks was an entirely consistent, completely applicable, formally workable system of modal logic, malleable to the mind of one man in particular, Anselm of Canterbury. Thanks, everybody. Have a good day.